the man who operates ports in 52 countries around the world, controls 30% of the United Kingdom's natural gas infrastructure, and built one of Europe's largest telecommunications networks, is now 96 years old and still wears the same inexpensive watch. Don't worry, this is not one of those videos that gives cliché advice like, "A watch is meant to tell time, not show wealth." This video tells the story of Li Ka-Shing, the man who taught some of the greatest investment lessons in the world, and the investment lessons hidden inside his story. Because Li Ka-Shing is not just a rich man, he is one of the people with the most consistent investment mindset in history. And today, I will explain exactly how that mindset works. Investment books usually start like this: if you have a small amount of capital, do this. But Li Ka-Shing's story starts even further back than that. Li Ka-Shing was born in 1928 in Chaozhou, a small city in southern China. His father was a school principal. He had books, knowledge, and dreams, but he had no money. In one interview, young Ka-Shing remembered watching his father study every day. He even mentioned that his father once told him, "We may not have money, but no one can take away what you learn." But life tested that sentence in a very cruel way. In 1940, Japan invaded China. The family fled. They carried everything they had on their backs and took refuge in Hong Kong. But Hong Kong was not easy either. And 2 years later, when Ka-Shing was 14 years old, his father died of tuberculosis. That night, Ka-Shing had no time to cry. His mother and siblings needed food. As we said earlier, most investment stories begin with the phrase, "I started with a small amount of capital." But Li Ka-Shing did not start from zero. His starting point was below zero. The reason we mention this is because it helps us understand every decision Li Ka-Shing made afterward. Ka-Shing got a job in a plastics factory. He worked 16 hours a day for only a few cents an hour. Years later, one of his former co-workers said, "Ka-Shing was always the first to arrive and the last to leave." But while working, he wasn't just working. He was observing everything: costs, sales, customers. He acted as if he would own the factory one day. Pay attention here, because this was the foundation of Li Ka-Shing's entire career. He saw things that other people did not see. When the other workers left the factory, they questioned nothing. Ka-Shing was constantly curious. Why is this material so expensive? Why does the customer want this product? What can change in the production process to reduce costs? Yes, he may not have had capital, but he had observation skills. And observation comes before capital. At the age of 22, Ka-Shing made a decision. I will no longer work for someone else. He took all his savings, rented a small workshop, hired a few workers, and started producing plastic flowers. It sounds simple, doesn't it? But in Hong Kong at that time, it was revolutionary. People wanted real flowers. But real flowers were expensive. Plastic flowers were cheap, but they did not look real. Ka-Shing saw this gap. For months, he tested hundreds of formulas, different colors, different materials, and different textures until one day he could no longer tell the difference between the plastic rose in his hand and a real one. At that moment, he gave the company a name, Chung Kong Industries, Long River, because he wanted to flow like the Yangtze River, the longest river in China. Unstoppable, continuous, powerful. But here is a critical question. Why plastic flowers? Because Ka-Shing saw a market gap, a demand that people wanted but could not satisfy. High demand, low supply, and low production cost. This formula never changed. For decades, every time he entered a new industry, he asked the same question: where is the thing that people want but cannot get? When Ka-Shing was 26 years old, an American buyer visited his factory. He represented a large company. He saw the flowers, picked them up, examined them, and then told Ka-Shing that these flowers could enter the American market. Imagine how fast your heart would beat after hearing that offer. And of course, they made the deal. The plastic flowers were shipped to America. Chung Kong became Hong Kong's largest exporter of plastic flowers. But most entrepreneurs stop there. I made it. I succeeded. I grew. Ka-Shing did not stop because he saw exports not as a goal but as a tool. He asked himself, what will happen to this money? And he found an answer. In the 1950s, Hong Kong was growing rapidly. People were moving from villages to the city. The population was exploding. Ka-Shing realized something. All of these people need a place to live. In other words, real estate. He started buying land with the money he earned from plastic flowers. Nobody understood him. Why would a plastic flower manufacturer buy land? Ka-Shing simply smiled because he could see 10 years ahead. Let's stop here for a moment, because this decision is the essence of Li Ka-Shing's entire investment philosophy. Let me explain the 6 main rules of his investment philosophy. First rule: turn today's profit into tomorrow's opportunity. Profit from plastic flowers became land investments. Second rule: follow the population. Where people go, money follows. Hong Kong was growing. Housing demand was unavoidable. Third rule: if everyone already sees the opportunity, you are too late. Nobody understood when Ka-Shing was buying land. By the time they understood, prices had already risen. Fourth rule: turn profits from one industry into the infrastructure of another industry. Plastic to real estate, to ports, to telecommunications to energy. Fifth rule: thinking small is more dangerous than taking big risks. Ka-Shing never said, "This is enough." But he also never expanded without control. Sixth rule: patience is the cheapest investment tool. He bought land and waited. He held it when nobody cared about it. The value eventually arrived. These 6 rules explain his entire career. Let's pause for a second. What I just described is the summary of concepts that investment books explain over dozens of pages. But Li Ka-Shing did not learn them from books. He learned them from life, starting in a factory at the age of 14. If you want to receive analyses like this regularly, subscribe to the channel. Every week we examine the greatest investment minds in history in exactly this format. Now let's continue, because the main lesson has not arrived yet. Now I will tell you about a critical moment. These moments are usually skipped in success stories. But I will not skip it because the real secret is here. In 1967, Hong Kong was experiencing major riots. Communist groups were protesting against British rule. Bombs were exploding, people were dying, and those who survived were selling their properties in panic and fleeing. Land prices collapsed, but Ka-Shing was buying those properties. "Are you crazy?" people around him asked. "This crisis is temporary," Ka-Shing replied, "but this land is permanent." Years later, the land he bought during that chaos became some of his most valuable assets. This strategy should sound familiar. During the 2008 financial crisis, everyone was selling. Markets fell by more than 50%. At that time, Warren Buffett was buying. He invested in Goldman Sachs and General Electric in the middle of the panic, and he won. This is not a coincidence. It is a principle. For those who panic, a crisis is destruction. For those who are prepared, it is an opportunity. Ka-Shing was always prepared because he got ready before the crisis arrived. He never invested all his money at once. He always kept reserves. When asked why, he replied, "Opportunities do not ask about timing. Either you are ready or you are not." Remember, cash is not a cost. Cash is the ticket price for an opportunity. Chung Kong Holdings was listed on the Hong Kong Stock Exchange. Ka-Shing was no longer just a businessman. He was now the leader of a publicly traded company. He carried the trust of thousands of shareholders, and he took that responsibility very seriously. In one interview, he said, "My shareholders trust me. That trust is not money. It is honor." Here, most business people think, "I am now public. I can take bigger risks. I can grow using other people's money." Ka-Shing thought the opposite. "I must be more careful now because this money is not only mine anymore. This approach became the foundation of his long-term credibility. In the investment world, trust is the most valuable asset. And trust can disappear with a single bad decision. Ka-Shing never forgot that. Now let me take you to Li Ka-Shing's biggest move. One of Hong Kong's oldest British companies, Hutchison Whampoa, was up for sale. The Hong Kong Shanghai Bank wanted to sell its 23% stake in the company. Ka-Shing bought the company. The boy who entered a factory at age 14 and the man who bought one of Hong Kong's most symbolic companies at age 51 were the same person. But this move was not only an emotional victory, there was a much more important investment lesson. Why did he buy Hutchison Whampoa? Because the company was priced far below its real value. Port infrastructure, a global trade network, long-standing customer relationships. These things have measurable value, and Ka-Shing did the math. This company is selling at a 50% discount. There is no reason not to buy it. After acquiring Hutchison Whampoa, Ka-Shing did not slow down. Instead, he changed direction. This difference is important. Slowing down means working less. Changing direction means working smarter. Ka-Shing was now thinking globally. Through Hutchison, he expanded port operations. He began operating ports at both ends of the Panama Canal. Goods from all over the world passed through his ports. He entered telecommunications in the United Kingdom, in Italy, in Australia. He entered the energy sector. He bought a large part of Britain's natural gas infrastructure. He also acquired electricity distribution companies, A.S. Watson Group, the world's largest health and beauty retail chain. More than 12,000 stores, 25 countries. And Li Ka-Shing was at the top of it all. But here is a very important question. Why did he not fail despite entering so many different industries? Because every time he entered a new industry, he asked the same question. Which assets in this industry are priced below their true value? At one point, Li Ka-Shing practically controlled daily life in Britain. You woke up and turned on the tap. His company. You turned on the stove and gas arrived. His company. You switched on the lights. His company. You made a phone call. His company. You went shopping. His company. You were waiting for an order through a port. His company. These numbers were remarkable. 25% of Britain's electricity distribution market, more than 30% of its natural gas supply, 7% of the water sector, and 40% of the telecommunications market. Once, The Economist wrote, Li Ka-Shing controls more Britons than the British Empire. What I just described is exactly what the investment world calls defensive investing. Infrastructure, energy, water, and telecommunications. These are the sectors that Buffett, Dalio, and major pension funds constantly hold. Have you ever considered assets like these in your own portfolio? In 1999, the mobile phone industry was changing. The internet was arriving, data usage was growing, and infrastructure was struggling to keep up. Ka-Shing owned Orange, a telecommunications company in the United Kingdom. It had a strong brand and a large customer base. But Ka-Shing saw that competition would become much tougher. Major players would enter the market. A medium-sized company would eventually get squeezed. Ka-Shing immediately sold Orange to management for $15 billion. At the time, it was one of the largest telecommunications deals in history. Everyone said he should not have sold. A few years later, the market collapsed. The telecom bubble burst. Ka-Shing had already exited. And this did not happen only once. He always acted this way. You should also become attached to value, not to assets. Because every asset eventually reaches its peak. And seeing the exact peak is usually impossible. But when an asset is approaching its peak, there are signals. Everyone starts talking about the sector. New competitors appear everywhere, and valuations reach historic highs. Ka-Shing saw those signals. And he acted. Ka-Shing has two sons, Victor and Richard. One morning, he sat down with them for breakfast. Boys, he said, you have another sibling. I am going to establish a foundation. and I will give 1/3 of my wealth to that foundation. This foundation is your sibling. It will not be considered family wealth. It will be considered a family member. That is how the Li Ka-Shing Foundation was born. To date, it has donated more than $3 billion. 80% of that has gone to China for education, healthcare, and poverty reduction. Why? One day he said, "I could not continue my education. Others should have that opportunity." But from an investment perspective, we see something else. Ka-Shing viewed reputation as his most valuable asset, and reputation grows through giving. Today, when people hear the name Li Ka-Shing, what do they think of? Not just money, reliability, vision, responsibility. This reputation supported his business relationships for decades because everyone wanted to work with him. Everyone trusted him. Giving is not only an ethical action, it is also a smart strategy. What I just described is the original version of what the modern financial world calls ESG investing: environmental, social, and governance values. Ka-Shing did not know the concept by name, but he lived it instinctively. Let's return to Ka-Shing. At 96 years old, he still wears an inexpensive watch set 30 minutes ahead. In one of his last interviews, a journalist asked, "Looking back at your life, what was your most important decision?" Ka-Shing thought for a long time. "When I first entered the factory," he said, "I made a decision. Every day I would learn something. No matter how small or how big, something. As long as I kept that promise, I never lost my direction. Learning one thing every day. It is that simple and that deep." He named his company Chung Kong, Long River. Rivers sometimes flow slowly, sometimes quickly. Sometimes they overflow, sometimes they dry up, but rivers always flow. They always move forward. They never stop. And neither did he. From plastic flowers to ports. From the streets of Hong Kong to the Panama Canal. From a 14-year-old boy to one of the world's greatest investors. The same man, the same question. What did I learn today? Now I want to turn to you. What is your plastic flower? In other words, what is the small thing that you do really well? Because Li Ka-Shing's story did not begin with something huge. It began with something small, real, and carefully done. And he grew that small thing by applying the lessons we discussed above. Without delay, with discipline, a little more every day.